Okay, welcome everybody to the New Zealand Schools Debating Championship Round 5 debate between Auckland White on the affirmative and Wellington Black on the negative. The motion is this House supports a universal basic income, and without further ado, we would invite the first affirmative speaker to open today's debate.
It was muted. People in New Zealand today who are unable to find employment and earn a living are forced to rely on a failing and insufficient benefit that socially isolates them. Side affirming is the only side in today's debate that is able to help these most disadvantaged, whereas the best that neg can do is lock them further into a cycle of poverty. So what are we going to prove to you in today's debate? We are the side that will tangibly improve the lives of these most vulnerable people. But how do we do this? We support in New Zealand a UBI that's about the level of a current benefit. That is to say, something that's enough for people to be able to buy essential goods and have shelter, but they probably would want to work to have the ideal quality of life. And we would do this through cutting the job seekers' benefit, but not, for instance, social programs like free healthcare or additional support for those like the most disabled who require really expensive care. And we would also do this through implementing a tax on the wealthiest and the most powerful businesses that profit at the expense of their employees. 3 points for the House today. Firstly, how do we get more accessible welfare? Secondly, how do we improve how people engage with work? And thirdly, Millie's going to split about how we lead to greater economic growth. Firstly then, on this point about the accessibility of welfare. In New Zealand at the moment, we see that there's a lot of people who are eligible for welfare or would benefit from it, but can never be reached by any more targeted relief even that they would propose on their side of the house. And there's two key reasons for this. Firstly, we see massive stigma around the welfare system. At the point where you have to be on a job seeker's benefit, you are seen as a failure to society because we simply live in a capitalist world where your worth is derived from your economic status and ability to support yourself. So there's two reasons why anything apart from a UBI would be unable to change this. Firstly, because the welfare system is in itself something that cannot be seen as positive. The government wants to minimize the amount of money that is spent on welfare, so they're not going to just encourage people to go out and get it. Secondly, though, the people who are in this kind of need, like beneficiaries, often have the lowest political power in a society. They're disenfranchised. They might not vote much. They aren't in the position to be able to donate to political parties and thus influence policy. So they're forced every time to just pick between the least worst options. With a UBI, we would be able to remove the stigma because simply everyone gets it. Secondly, though, the current benefit system is incredibly complicated. To be on a job seeker benefit, you have to prove that you're looking for a job, but if you don't get any interviews, then you might not be able to prove that. There's simply no way that everyone who needs it is going to be caught in. And this is something that would be the case for any welfare system. So why is this necessarily bad? Firstly, it requires that for this amount of proof to be undertaken, you have like social workers intruding in people's lives and noting if they have anything that like is particularly valuable or could make them money. But secondly, though, any kind of limit that is set is always going to have people who are just above it who would benefit from being able to have that. We see this in the current status quo as well. We have, for instance, students going to university who are unable to like pay for it at the moment and end up in massive debt, but that's somehow not recognized as something where they would be able to benefit from having any much more money. So what do we actually see then if we were to implement a UBI? There's two main ways we would fix this. Firstly, at the point where everyone receives a payout, there is no stigma because it's not seen as something that only the poor in society are able to get. Secondly, though, we aren't relying on external people to judge people's worth. The significant cost that comes from all of the surveying is completely removed and can be redirected to actually helping the people who need it access a welfare system. So we see that people are more likely to spend this money that they might be able to get. Poverty in itself is seen as less negatively, and we open the way to further social change. I can't tell if you are offering a POI, so if you are.
Yep. So why should taxpayer money be going to rich people instead of our chronically underfunded public sector?
We think that the significant benefits we get to that significantly like underfunded public sector still from enabling all of this to be seen and like less stigma around people who need to benefit from that public sector is going to outweigh this. If rich people get a bit of money, that's probably not going to make a massive difference, but it makes a massive difference for people using a public sector if they can. Secondly, though, how do we shift how people engage with work? And we think this is an especially important point, which is why you'll bear with me if it's a bit long, because in the next 20 years, there are hundreds of thousands of people who will lose their jobs to robots and computers. And this is particularly important because these are changes that affect both the rich and the poor. It looks like trucking jobs and manufacturing jobs being lost, but also some things, for instance, in law and medicine. So 3 key ways in which we create change. 4 key ways, sorry. Firstly, we enable people to take beneficial economic risk. At the moment, we see a lot of people who are stuck in jobs that they don't want or aren't the best at, just because they don't want to risk failing and ending up on the benefit that we've shown you has significant stigma. This looks like people who, for instance, would want to start a small business, but don't have the risk or financial capital to build that up. Or it looks like people who want to be creative and go into like establishing themselves as artists, for instance, and creating connections, but can't be eligible for a job seeker's benefit that would be required for them to have time to set this up. How do we help these people? Firstly, we enable them to support themselves while they create a job that is going to be sustainable in this changing world. Secondly, though, we change a system. Millie will expand on this in the split, where you can only take out a loan to build up your money if you already have some money. And thus we equalize things and give people the starting capital that they would need to create change for themselves. And thus overall, we get beneficial effects for culture and enabling people to support themselves. Secondly, we push up wages for people who are in jobs. At the moment, we see that most people can't afford to be unemployed for a significant time. They don't have the savings for it, and they don't want to be seen, particularly if they come from like a middle class, as someone who's on the benefit. And the minimum wage is simply not enough. And thus we get a system where employers can pay employees whatever they want just so that they get some kind of impact. That's why, for instance, Amazon workers are paid next to nothing, while Jeff Bezos is worth like tens of billions of dollars. What can a UBI do to change this? At the point where we see that people can survive longer without being on a job, we see that employees have larger bargaining power when they're asking for like higher wages or better working conditions. Thus, these working conditions become more prevalent. Thirdly, we also enable the impact of social unpaid labor to increase. We see a lot of people at the moment who are in jobs that are simply not recognized. This looks maybe like caring for your family members or looking after your children and being a stay-at-home parent. And these people are struggling because they can only afford to undertake these things if they, for instance, have a wealthy partner or are super overworked with a second job. We fundamentally help these people to do these things if they think that it is best, and thus giving them autonomy over their lives. And furthermore, we correct a power imbalance whereby these people are reliant on, say, their wealthy partners and thus have less control because they can fundamentally support themselves if they choose. Comparatively, if they come out and say they're just going to increase social support, firstly, this is probably minimal. We'd see a system like the UK where care workers are so underpaid. And secondly, it reinforces the idea that this is something you can only do if you don't have any other options. Fourthly, then, this encourages people to get back into the workforce. We have a benefit gap at the moment where if you stop your minimum wage job, benefit that you lose then means that you overall get paid less. At this point where we introduce a UBI, thus it is always more economically beneficial to have a job, we see more people being incentivized to get into the workforce and thus overall have a more productive workforce where people can prepare for the modern world. Proud to propose.
We thank the speaker for her speech, and when the edges are all ready, we will invite the first negative speaker to open their team's case.
Wellington strip.
Oh, not again.
Have we lost Wellington?
No. Did they catch the entire speech?
Oh, we are here. Sorry. The laptop was just showing the kids Facebook messages, so Ailey had to fix it. But it's been fixed, and our speaker is coming.
Awesome. I'm ready. We know the other judges are, Peter.
No, just Ailey's personal messages.
Okay, if we're all ready to go. Can we welcome the first negative speaker?
Okay, ready to start? I think so, yes, okay. The state sector is falling apart. Our public hospitals are understaffed and their walls are lined with mold. Public housing has an immense wait list, and our private housing is both increasingly unaffordable and destroying people's health through bad standards. The other team stands for writing checks and hoping for the best we can do, while we can fix the chronic issues that are plaguing the social safety net. So with that in mind, here's our burden for this debate. We're going to prove that we are better able to reduce poverty and hardship in New Zealand to better break that cycle of poverty that AF is so concerned about. What is our counter model? We want to dramatically expand the welfare state. We say we can do this because AF has said that they're going to be, they're putting out a lot of money in the benefits, so they're going to be dramatically raising taxes. We're going to do this too and put all of this new money into funding for the welfare state. So what is that going to look like? It's going to look like a massive amount of public housing, have a lot of investment into our public healthcare system, free university education right the way through, kindergarten, primary school, high school, university, etc., free electricity, free broadband. We also say that our model is completely mutually exclusive because the government cannot afford both a UBI and to dramatically expand the welfare state. So those are the comparatives in this debate. So I'm going to do some rebuttal before I move on to my two substantive points, which are why the government is more effective than the private sector at providing public resource, and secondly, why expanded social services are better at helping people who are struggling and in poverty. Okay, but firstly, some rebuttal, because they say they'll give us people more money, but what they don't do is they don't increase the failing social services that I've laid out are the real issue in our society. They also told you that people have this massive stigma towards collecting money, so they won't get it and their families will starve. But we say that the incentive to stop your family starving, to give your child food, is much greater than being slightly maybe some stigma against being on the social service benefit. You have much more of an incentive to feed your family. So we don't think that's the case in many circumstances, that people are put off by the stigma when they have much greater incentives driving them. They also told you that you get an opportunity to take risks and in business and start a small business and all these great things to get you off the ground. But when you're giving people that AF has given them a tiny amount of money with the benefit money, that's not enough to bank a small business on. And when you're living paycheck to paycheck, you can't build up extra capital to be able to take risks with your employer or start a small business, because that's simply just not enough money that is being provided. So we don't think they get their benefits there. Anyway, on to my first point about why the government is more effective than the private sector at providing public resource. We say that when we get a UBI, that means the private sector is still going to be providing most of these services, like housing to a great extent, because the amount of social housing happening at the moment, uni education, private healthcare, etc. So we say that the government is motivated by social good compared to the private sector, which has none of these incentives. Because if we take the example of housing, private companies, they want profit, not social good. That is at the core of their proceedings. So they are much more likely to build a fancy house that they could sell for $2 million with a massive backyard and all the bells and whistles, and appeal to the upper middle class, than they are to build an apartment block that can house 100 people on the same amount of land. And they go with this cultural norm, which is the Kiwi dream of owning a home. They can only rather than change it. We say the government can change the social norm in the country by controlling what housing is built, and the government wants the social goods, so they're more likely to build these big apartment blocks that are going to serve the population much better and get everyone in a house. We say, yes, they might not have a backyard, but they are living in a safe house with no black mold, so they will be able to thrive and live. Everybody can get that because the government is not motivated by profit, it is motivated by max social good. We see an example of this in Singapore, where basically everyone is in housing. Yes, it is high rise, but they have a great social security net in terms of housing. People are not on the streets. Okay, and we say yes, Kiwi Build failed, but that's probably because there was not enough investment from the government, not enough political capital. When we have all this money that we are dumping into we can achieve this effectively. Okay, and another example could be healthcare, right? So With the UBI, the state system sucks. We've already established that. So people are going to take the money they're getting from the UBI and go to the private healthcare sector. We think this is bad because people can only they can only advocate for themselves. So like one hip replacement against this economy of scale when the government the price for everybody, they can lower the cost of that, for example. So, and we think the same incentives exist for education. We get like better funded education when the government steps in. Okay, but UBI is wasteful because it's giving money to the rich who don't need it and don't deserve it. They already have millions. It's only a tiny drop of water in the bucket that they're not going to be appreciating. What do we get at the end of this point? We get much more effective distribution of resources in terms of healthcare, in terms of housing, most importantly. That means more people are able to thrive and like actually get the resources that they live. Whereas AF relies on the private sector to provide service. We have already told you that they get minimum benefits because they don't address the underlying issues. They just give people a little bit of money they definitely can't afford to buy a fancy house with. I'll take a point now.
Okay, so most of the time the benefit is either more or so close to the minimum wage that there is absolutely no incentive for someone on the benefit to get a job. How does your side incentivize these people to go out and find employment?
Well, obviously that people are wanting to work, that they have this hope that they can work their way up through the system, get more money. There is more money from a job than you get from the benefit. That is the way it works. So you're of course incentivized to seek more money through getting a job and working your way up through the system than you are by sitting back on the benefit. Okay, on to my second point about why expanded social service better serve people struggling and in poverty. Because we say that currently, once again, the social services are collapsing and decrepit. The healthcare, like there was a recent report saying the state of the hospitals is dire. The primary sector in terms of GPs, etc., is completely underfunded. Middlemore Hospital had black mold lining the walls. In education, we see the same thing. Classrooms falling into disrepair, massive classes that teachers cannot corral. So we say we give more money for education and health to make them better. Like AF does not improve this, does not give people pathways towards improving their lives through better health and education. They just give them a bit more money that they can spend in an already broken system. They can't give people the opportunity to lift themselves up. But also we say that there's an underlying issue with not enough supply. So we get more supply because we produce more housing when we invest in the housing market. But in the comparative in F, there is no more housing supply, so instead they get more competition. Landlords or providers realize that they can raise the cost. For example, when the benefit was increased, then house prices rose by about, the rent rose by like $40 in student areas because landlords realized, look, we can just charge more and people will be able to pay it. Why don't we? So there's an incentive for people just to raise money. There's more competition there. We also say wealthy developers will buy up the land. So people on the UBI definitely can't compete with the rich people who are there to buy, to produce their nice houses with the backyards. They can't buy that land and build their own houses. And we also said that UBI doesn't address the root cause of poverty, the root for many people. So maybe people are addicted. So they're spending the money they're getting on the UBI, on their drugs, on their gambling, and they don't get the benefits of the social services because they are completely broken. They don't have the ability to break out of this cycle and find a better life. Whereas when we fix these social services and get better healthcare, better counseling, better addiction services, we can actually help them break out of that and get a life for themselves. Okay, and also like, for example, if you're in childcare, you have no one, you've got a child you're trying to work, but you can't because you have to stay home and look after your child. We get better healthcare, education under our side of the house, better childcare, so that you can actually go out and earn a living and trust that your child is in safe hands. Okay, so we improve, like ensure people aren't living paycheck to paycheck. We actually improve services that can lift them up beyond just the benefit, because while our social services are still overrun and still completely broken, we can never move forward as a country.
We thank the speaker for her speech, and when the adjudicators are ready, we will invite the second affirmative speaker to continue their side's case.
Can I start? Or cool.
Yep, I believe that everyone is ready. So yep, so we invite the second affirmative speaker to continue their team's case.
I want to be crystal clear in my speech here today, because even if you pump billions more dollars into healthcare, which we told you at first we are still perfectly happy to do, we still totally have the political capital to do, you don't solve the root problem of people not being able to start businesses. The root problem of automation, meaning that hundreds of thousands of people will lose their jobs and not turn to benefits because of massive fears around things like stigma. Simply put, they just wanted to talk about education when we want to talk about meaningfully uplifting the ability for people to make good choices in terms of their lives. That is what we want to win on today, and that's what I'm going to do in my speech. I'm going to talk about three things. First of all, how are we able to meaningfully improve poverty on an individual level? Second of all, how we are able to enfranchise everyone into poverty reduction. And then thirdly, we tell you how we are able to cause greater economic growth. First of all, on how we improve poverty for all. What they told us as their counter model is they wanted to just spend massive amounts of money in terms of social services, like things like healthcare and things like education. First of all, I'd like to flag, panel, that we told you at first that we're okay with certain boosts in spending. If it is of course true that hospitals have mold growing in them, of course we're willing to put money into those kinds of things. We tell you if you're implementing massive wealth taxes on the wealthy, we are totally legitimate in this kind of action, but we're telling you that we probably should give people, give students more money so they can spend on what they want rather than making university free. That's more empowering for those individuals, and particularly for those individuals that don't pursue things like university. That's our crucial contention in today's debate. Additionally, they wanted to bring you something very briefly here about how they have no obligation to give money to the wealthy. This is really critical in today's, and so this is really critical in terms of why this is so wrong. First of all, we tell you that wealthy people under their side of the house will still benefit from the mass amounts of social expenditure they were talking about. So when they told you that it was illegitimate for us to give cash handouts to the wealthy, those cash handouts will occur for the wealthy under their side of the house in terms of free education and free healthcare. We tell you that that's probably asymmetric on both sides of the house. But crucially, we are totally okay with extending money to the wealthy because we think that is what's going to happen to ensure we don't have things like those massive arbitrary turn-ins to just like massive privacy interruptions to ensure that people are like fit for the benefit and they deserve it, and ensuring that those people are like the legitimate people that deserve it. That's really crucial in this debate because even if it means to spend a bit of money on wealthy people, one, they're probably already paying like 10, 20 times more than that in terms of taxes towards this program, but secondarily, that ensures we don't have those massive privacy incursions. That is something that is always going to be true under their side of the house, because as long as benefits are means testers, if they tell you that they were always going to be, you're always going to have massive stigma around poverty. They told you that just wasn't true because what was going to happen is that people are going to not want to starve. We tell you that's not what poverty looks like in New Zealand. It looks like a 30-year-old person sleeping on their parents' couch because they can't have a job and can't afford to like make their lives better, but because they come from a middle-class family, they're never going to want to go into the benefit. So they stay in their parents' house for long periods of time. They never pursue that education. Comparatively on our side of the house, we extend them the benefit. It means what happens is they are able to get a better job and meaningfully improve their life in terms of choice. They're able to make the decision either to go into training, or they're able to start their own business, or they're able to just have enough money to stay by until they can get themselves a job. Crucially, we tell you that you reduce a ton of factors that go into like the social elements of poverty, because all they would have on their side of the house is people who still live on the benefit, still who are forced into these massively awful situations where they like privacy is incurred all the time, but they just have like nicer healthcare or nicer education. Crucially, we tell you that creates no incentive for those individuals to go to work. We tell you that because their benefit structures are always going to necessarily exclude lots and lots of people, they're necessarily going to exclude people who have jobs, exclude people with relatively decent jobs. People are never going to be able to want to get those jobs in the first place because it's comparatively better for them to just stay on welfare and not work. We tell you that you create a system where work is always valued, always meaningfully improves their life, and thus they're going to get jobs. That's especially crucial when we talk about people in my next point of clash. But at the end of this, we tell you solve poverty for a number of reasons better on our side of the house. First of all, you allow people better choice, so that this money is going towards things that people understand makes their lives more meaningfully better. Second of all, it encourages those individuals to get jobs. And third of all, it massively destigmatizes poverty and allows all people access to these kinds of social inclusion, things like the workplace, things like having friends that don't just think they're like lazy bums, that make life so important for these people. Briefly now into why we enfranchise everyone, because this is really critical material in our case that was really badly responded to. Material about how we include under systems, like people that decide to be stay-at-home parents, people that do massive amounts of labor that just aren't valued by our economic systems, This is crucial because under their side of the house, you still have stay-at-home mums who have a massive social imbalance because their wealthy partner can always exploit them because they have no capacity to have money, which means that they meaningfully improve their lives. It tell you that it always means under their side of the house that people who want to like take 2 years off work so they can write their book, spend time creating art, are never able to do that kind of thing because they necessarily can't get a benefit because they are employable and because job seeker won't accept them. That's really important under our side of the house because we tell you that those kinds of things are really socially beneficial, and simply them saying that it's okay because they're going to have better healthcare at the end of the day wasn't a good enough response to this kind of thing. Additionally, they told us that small business owners aren't going to be affected because you need far more capital in the first place. The crucial thing about this is, first of all, it means that you have some capital. The thing when you go and get a small business loan in the first place is you need some money to put up in the first place. But secondarily, it's really critical in this debate that they have a safety net to fall back on. Their attacks on like this being a system that is massively stigmatized was never good enough. Middle-class people are never going to want to seek welfare because in a capitalist system, they are seen as tools, they're seen as bad. That's crucial at the end of the day. Before I move on to my substantive material, I'll take a POR there as well. Sorry, you're muted.
All right. When UBI can only keep you barely above the poverty line, living paycheck to paycheck, how can you reasonably expect people to start a business? Okay, here's the thing. We think that what's going to happen is they earn a small amount of income from that small business. But crucially, in those early setup days, they're going to be able to, like, as most small business owners do, earn on a reduced income in order to start that business. What is critical, though, is they have some semblance of a fallback plan in case it fails. Even if that is not great, it is better than nothing. It's better than being locked out of systems of welfare. That's crucial. That gets more economic growth, which leads me on to my split material about why we just get broadly more economic growth. This is really important because if they want to talk about like the economy being better for everyone, if they want to talk about like disempowering like big corporations from controlling our world, this is really important because it gives every person in the economy more power when you have more money through and through it. First of all, we tell you address massive amounts of credit inequality that causes bad business to exist. I briefly flagged this, as did Freddie earlier in my speech. But what we're going to tell you is that to get a loan to start a business in the first place, you have to have some money in the bank. This necessarily means the only people that can ever start small businesses come from relatively wealthy positions, meaning that people that would have good businesses that would be economically beneficial are never able to start them under their side of the house because they have no access to credit. We tell you that this small amount of money, which people can get no questions asked, acts almost as an introduction credit pool, which they can put up to a bank as collateral. That lets more businesses being started, but crucially more businesses that will be super economically beneficial. Secondly, we tell you you would empower more people to take great, positive economic risks. That was already covered earlier in my speech. But very briefly, fourthly, we tell you there's going to be way less resistance to automation because under their side of the house, jobs are still going to go and that income is not going to be replaced under their side. People are still going to be materially worse off in the ways that they care about, not just in things like healthcare. That's crucial because there's been massive resistance to programs like automation, which make the economy more efficient. We tell you improve those efficiencies while empowering people's lives and empowering communities. That's crucial. We win today's debate.
We thank the speaker for her speech, and if the edges are all ready, we would now invite the second negative speaker to continue their team's case.
Yeah, Peter, don't worry about us being ready. Feel free to just keep going.
Awesome. Okay, then we invite second negative to continue their team's case.
The opposing team is living in a world where they're able to both increase the funding for our many deeply underfunded social services, and at the same time are able to undergo a life-changing economic system for the entire New Zealand population. On our side of the house, we see that is not possible, that is largely a mutually exclusive model. I'm going to talk in my speech today about how general inflation makes the effects of a universal basic income negligible and most importantly harms those who are currently in the welfare system. But first, I'm going to characterize briefly what's happened in the debate in 3 questions. The first is, how does this affect the current work environment? The second is the current welfare system accessible enough? And the third is, what are the actual effects of the current welfare system? But first, a brief point about whether or not a model is mutually exclusive. On our side of the house, we say that yes, based on the funding, it absolutely is. But even if it weren't, this debate is about how we allocate those resources. And if you have a massive increase in funding, we would much rather put them towards our social services instead of a universal basic income. So first, on the idea of how does the universal basic income affect the system of work? No, thank you. So first, briefly on the idea of automation, the opposition has characterized that massive job losses are coming and we need to deal with them. This is largely a myth that automation will cause huge job losses. Farming used to have 90% of the population working in it. Now it has less than 1% of the population in most countries, but new jobs get created. Maybe it's in marketing the new produce, or maybe it's IT, or maybe it is in whatever. However, on top of that, our industries in New Zealand aren't really based on things like manufacturing. That's not a huge thing here. So even if every manufacturing job were to disappear, there'll be a tiny section of the population who could then go to our welfare system. But finally, even if every job were destroyed by automation somehow in this world, you can't sustainably keep jobs going on the job seeker benefit of the whole population. It's not economically possible. And even if it were, the whole population cannot survive on that amount of money. Then on the idea of people avoiding no, thank you, and that they fear losing their jobs, so they won't pursue things like loans. The opposition doesn't allow more accessible loans. The first reason is that even if you could acquire more loans, just because you have a small amount of capital for collateral doesn't mean that you'll actually be able to survive the loan. If you have 20% or whatever, even if your business fails, perhaps you weren't in a position to run a business in the first place, you then have a massive amount of debt saddled on top of you. So if you put this in the position where a lot of the population suddenly can get easily available loans, what you often get is way too many loans that people aren't able to handle. You only disenfranchise them in the future. But more importantly, they won't get more loans, even if they could in a magical world, because banks will simply raise the thresholds because you haven't increased the amount of money the banks have. The banks, they raise interest rates, they reduce the amount of loans when more people want them or when the risks are higher. So therefore, no, you're not actually allowing more loans in the first place. You have not increased the money supply. In fact, your side of the house probably reduces the money supply with large-scale taxes. There was then the idea of more bargaining power in the workplace. This analysis from before continues. If you are taxing businesses to a higher level and everyone is increasing their amount of money, you have not increased the available amount of jobs. So, when someone is trying to bargain with their major corporation workplace, they don't necessarily have another job to go to because they're nowhere if you increase the amount of jobs. And on our side of the house, we have a model in which we incentivize increased allocation of resources to things like education, which actually give you the ability to bargain. If you have a better education, if you have more skills, which actually gives you more job opportunities, simply having money doesn't allow you the ability to suddenly get another job in the first place. Finally, there was the idea of unpaid labor not being paid for. Yes, motherhood is not paid for, or fatherhood as a stay-at-home parent isn't paid for. That's a shame, but we think the education system does that so much better, that trained professionals can do it a lot better. And most importantly, that on my split point, that if inflation massively raises the prices of general goods, it's very negligible when it comes to actually paying for these things in the first place. So does this affect the workplace? Not really. Inflation largely reduces most impacts the opposition can bring forward. But even then, the fundamental problem is that social services like education and healthcare that we put the most money into on our side of the house, the opposition dismissed it largely. They are what create jobs, they create skills, and they create lasting development for people in poverty. They have good health, they have good education. In the future, their kids have awesome jobs that they can do. Then on the question of, is the current welfare system accessible? There was an idea that's gone throughout the whole debate. Is there stigma around the welfare system? First of all, we say absolutely not. We think that, even poor New Zealanders are smart enough to realize they don't want to see their kids being cold or their kids not having adequate clothing, or even if they're not necessarily starving. I'm sure it'd be extremely emasculating to have to sleep on your parents' couch. I'd much rather go on the job seeker benefit and then actually be able to have my own place to live in. But more importantly, let's say it's so much stigma. We have a lot. First of all, a good chunk of the population receives some kind of government support. I believe half the population gets working for families or something. Just having kids is deemed enough for state support. It's made very accessible. But more importantly, even if it wasn't, you don't have to tell people these things. You can keep it to yourself. And most of your community doesn't need to know your own welfare. That's not necessary for the system. There was then the idea that, is the current system extremely complicated? We deny this. We say we try and make it as accessible as possible, but what would make it more accessible is extra funding. They would hire more people to actually process you, would make more people to actually distribute social welfare, it would make it a lot easier. But more importantly, a lot of the things we propose, like education, are intentionally designed to be something you sign up for and you do it for years. It's not difficult to get your kid into school. In fact, it's a legal requirement. Same thing with something like GP visits. You know, on the issue of underfunding, we've seen that doctors' visits used to be free up until age 18. Now it's age 13. They're being rolled back because they're losing funding. We'd love it if people weren't afraid to go to the doctor. We'd actually make it as accessible as possible by expanding these social services. Then there was the idea that we cut people off. So how the job seeker benefit works is for every extra dollar you work over about $20,000, you lose 10 cents of your benefit, but it will always be more beneficial to actually take the job because jobs will always provide objectively more money than a benefit ever could. So it doesn't disincentivize people, but you know, to receive a job seeker benefit is a requirement to look for work and to attempt to get interviews. And so, you know, you are encouraged to get work under our system, but we still make it very much so accessible. Students receive a means tested allowance. We don't really see a problem here. That's wonderful. If your parents don't earn enough to support you, you get a great amount of support there. And on the idea of surveying, we see a lot more wasted money in giving millionaires or even the upper middle class thousands of dollars a year instead of paying a few social workers to actually work on this. If you're giving, say, the top 150,000 New Zealanders several $1,000s a year, that's hundreds of millions of dollars being spent that could absolutely be spent for the surveying cost. I will take it now, yes.
There's people who are growing up in houses where families are on the benefit and see that that is a possible way to live. Why do they want to take up free education and work in order to buy a Kiwi build house?
I would say, okay, so the first thing is state housing being provided more just makes it cheaper and more available. But under our system, you're actually incentivized to go to the education because you maybe have a smaller class size, you have a more engaging teacher, and you don't have a class that is cold and filled with mold. You're not incentivized to drop out of school. And as I said, while the benefit is very accessible, it's not something you could live on for your entire life exclusively. Paid work will always give you way more money. Then briefly on the idea of the effects of the current system, is it exclusionary toward people like artists? You know, if you're writing a wonderful novel and it will sell, that's awesome. If it won't, that's a shame. If you're writing a book that no one wants to read, I'm sorry, I'm not going to pay you for a book that no one wants to read. You should get a productive job, or you can, but however, you can go, if you actually don't have any money and you're unable to support yourself, we have an accessible welfare system. Your kids can go to a free education system. And if you need to go to the doctor for any of your health concerns, you can 100% pay for them and a doctor will be there for you under our system. And finally, will people be able to buy things that they deem helpful? We think a lot of people in poverty are struggling with issues like addiction or like crime in the area, and therefore feeding their addiction by giving them money is not a way to get them out of poverty. In fact, it will keep them there. That's the real poverty trap. If you're an alcoholic and we're giving you checks to buy more beer, I'd rather you go to a counselor or a therapist who can help you deal with your problems, and your kids can have a fantastic education. And I'm really running out of time, but my split point, there's okay. Inflation, if there's more money in the economy, it will be spent more, and that means general goods will rise. That means essential goods will be more expensive, and most importantly, yes, essential goods will be more expensive for the poorest people who are getting less money because we've allocated resources to the universal basic income. Thank you.
We for his speech, and would now invite the third negative speaker to conclude the substantive portion of their team's case.
Hear me all good? The negating side of the House today came out with a case that actually failed to address any of the issues surrounding these people in today's debate, because they failed to address the clear issues we brought you at first and right down the line about the failings of the welfare system and the fact that they would be unable to support these people in such a manner that we can. Three main points of clash for you today. Firstly, which side which side better enables people to get out of poverty? Secondly, which side gives the lower class more choice and opportunity? And then thirdly, which side creates economic growth? So firstly, onto this point about which side better enables people to get out of poverty. So they presented us today with this counter model of essentially like pouring money into the private sector, the public sector, and into public services. Three main responses to this for you today. Firstly, this is far more expensive than our model, recognised, right? As they also keep the benefit, whereas we take the money that was previously used in the benefit and put it into our plan, right? This means the government has less money and can't do as much in terms of actually providing education, right? We think their model was a bit unrealistic and they won't be able to have the fast spread changes that they wanted to state. But secondly, what this does is cause absolutely huge taxes, right? So even if they can fund this, they get absolutely massive taxes. And what this does is it further stigmatizes the impoverished, right? Because those who have to pay the massive taxes now think of those impoverished as like leeches who are like sucking from the government and stuff like that, right? This is a really harmful stigmatization, right? As it means that like, because these people who are having to pay the majority of taxes are likely to be the employers and the people who are hiring the lower class and the impoverished people. And so this means they're less likely to hire these people as their stigma leads them believing they're like not hard workers and they're like, you know, not the right sort to have in the job, or it leads to them like exploiting them and paying like the smallest amount possible, and so that they cannot really have like a decent wage, right? But thirdly, on this point, it makes these impoverished people really reliant, right? Because as either like they have a Kiwi build house, which is too expensive for them to buy because they're still on a benefit, which they aren't being provided with much, or they are renting it, which means they're still relying on the government. And this not only puts them in a precarious situation where the government essentially controls their future, and any like changes in the economy could mean that they end up not actually being able to pay for that rent, but also it increases the stigmatization and it continues to lead to those further harms which I brought to you just before. They then told us in like a response to our POI that these people, when we told you that they wouldn't have an incentive to work because the benefit was essentially a same or similar, you know, amount, that like they would have an incentive to work as they wanted to work their way up, right? This was an incredibly assertive response, and two reasons why it doesn't work. So firstly, if you can get paid similar amounts for working or not working, what are you going to do, right? It's pretty simple. You're probably not going to work because you lose your benefit when you actually get this job. And when this minimum wage job is forcing you to work an incredible amount of hours a week and you are being put through a whole bunch of work by your employer just to get minimum wage, we think these people are going to stick to the benefit. Secondly, it's incredibly hard for these people to find a job because of these stigmas and and because they're seen as like sucking from the government and being on the benefit, right? The stigma that we've brought you throughout the case, which means they have an incredibly hard time finding a job. But thirdly, on this point, living off the benefit has become normalized for a lot of these people as they've grown up on it, right? And so it's become normalized for them to just simply live off that and actually not search for a job. They then brought us like this. So now moving on to the second point of clash, which side gives more choice and opportunity for the lower class? So we gave you analysis on not only how we get these people jobs, but how we also gave them the chance to like start businesses, right? And create and innovate themselves, right? They said banks like simply wouldn't give loans, and so like they wouldn't be able to do this. Two responses to this for you today. Firstly, banks will have more money because there will be more spending in our economy, as we've told you right down the line. But secondly, it's not just about the banks, right? When we implement a UBI, these people simply have a safety net for when they want to like start a business or like, you know, start up something, because they have the safety net to fall back on if it fails. And additionally, they have more capital to start it up with, right? Because someone who is on the benefit or is impoverished might have a really good business idea, but because they're unable to secure any finances, they simply don't have the money to start it up. This UBI provides them with the money to do so, and therefore gives them the opportunity to do this. They also then told us that Yeah, so we also then told you that we provide an opportunity for like, because of the safety net, which allows like these people to wait to find a job where employers will actually value them and will actually pay them like less than minimum wage and not like completely exploit them, right? Their side didn't really have a response to this. This is absolutely crucial because recognize that the difference between the two sides of the house here is that their side of the house, at the very best, and even then it's unlikely, gets these people minimum wage jobs where they have to work hours upon hours a week and get barely any like progress and barely any movement up the social like ladder. Our side of the house provides them with an opportunity to innovate and get better jobs and start up their own businesses and therefore move their way up successfully and be able to make like more than just like the bare minimum of a living, right? And so at the end of this point, we think it's absolutely clear that not only are we the side that gets these people actually out of poverty best, but we are also now the side that gives them more of a choice and opportunity. I'll take a POI now if you have
one. Aren't economic mobility and inequality decreased when poor people are able to get a good education to outcompete their richer counterparts?
Well, we just don't think that that's actually true, right? Because we think there is like a lot of these people on higher wages are earning like exorbitant amounts that they really do not need, and they are unlikely to actually pay these poor people because of the stigma. We remove that stigma and allow a more like equal spread of the wealth to occur on our side of the house. So now moving on to the third point of clash, which side creates economic growth? So they told us that we like can't create this economic growth and like this like automation that we told you about because it was like mutually exclusive to like, you know, economic growth and like people coming out of the poverty cycle. Two main responses to this for you today. Firstly, we told you right at the start of this debate that we stood for huge taxes, right? We never denied that. And so we think that these taxes will we think these taxes like will allow this to occur, right? And will allow these people to be raised out. But secondly, even if it is exclusive, and even in our worst case, right, we might not have that much money to do as much investment as we want, but we still have enough for the necessities, right? We still have enough to improve that hospital that has mold in it and things of that nature, right? They also then brought us this point about like inflation, right? And about how our side causes inflation, so we actually don't get the benefits of this. But recognize that first of all, this happens on both sides, right? Inflation still occurs on both sides. It's not mutually exclusive to us, but also and critically that inflation only occurs when there's like a large increase in money without like a large increase of the stuff actually being like produced, right? And so their side of the house just brings in a whole bunch more money being invested, whereas on our side of the house, we are producing much more because people are like starting up their own businesses and people are buying a lot more and spending a lot more. So at the end of today's debate, not only are we the side that actually raises these people out of poverty, we also allow them to better themselves beyond that and create economic growth while doing so. Proud to propose.
We thank the speaker for his speech, and now to close out the substantive portion of today's debate, we invite the third affirmative speaker to the floor. Sorry, the third negative speaker to give their speech.
You go to a hospital to get better, but if right now you walk into Middlemore Hospital, you will get sicker. The role of the state is to keep its people housed, healthy, and educated, and this is what it has currently failed at, and no amount of check writing will fix the chronic underfunding plaguing our welfare state. So, 3 points of clash for this debate. Firstly, how is our model realistic? Secondly, how does this impact people living in poverty? And lastly, who gets better outcomes for the economy as a whole? So onto the first point of clash, is our model actually practical? So what we've been told by the opposition is that our model wouldn't work because it would be too expensive, but so would a UBI, and they have conceded that. At third, they have said that this would require significant raises in tax dollars, and that is something we are also willing to do to the same extent that they are. What they've said to this is that, well, they could also increase funding for hospitals and health, hospitals and education, as well as having a UBI. But what we say to that is that every marginal increase in money should be allocated to these services rather than the UBI, because every dollar going to the UBI is the dollar not going to a state school and not going to a hospital, and that is where we think that money should be going. So any increase in tax revenue should be solely focused on services. None of it, and not a single cent of it, should be going to a UBI. So onto the second point of clash. So that's how we would find our model. So onto this around how this impacts people in poverty. So we've heard a few responses to this. Firstly, the opposition talked about the poverty trap that currently plagues the welfare system. They say that there is no incentive to get out of the benefit. This is inconsistent with how the welfare system actually works in New Zealand. If you go onto the job seekers benefit, you cannot just live off the job seekers benefit forever, because you have to provide evidence that you are searching for a job, evidence that you actually deserve the benefit because you are unable to find one. That is one mechanism as to why the poverty trap is a myth. Secondly, it's not like a proportional amount of money. It's not like every extra dollar you earn is $1 less you get in benefits. At current rates, every additional dollar you earn from your job means you get 10 from your benefits. So every additional dollar you get from a job means you get 90 more cents at the end of the day. That is still an incentive to work and not stay on the job seekers benefit indefinitely. Thirdly, people actually just like having a job because it makes them feel like they're contributing to society. So this is why the poverty trap does not exist, because of how the structural nature of the job seekers benefit exists. And that is something that has actually been acknowledged by the opposition. The opposition has said simultaneously that it's difficult with the job seekers benefit because of these invasions of privacy, which we think are fully justified in terms of means testing. This is something that they have said at first, but then they've gone back at later speakers and say that, oh, actually, just anyone can get onto the job seekers benefit and never work. It is inconsistent within their case. Secondly, we've heard about the stigma that would just stop people from going into poverty. So firstly, I'd like to point out that it's interesting that they think what poverty looks like in New Zealand is someone from a middle-class background in their 30s living with their parents. They think that is what poverty looks like in New Zealand. No, that's not it. What poverty looks like is struggling to turn the heating on in your house because you cannot afford electricity. Poverty looks like not being able to afford a house that isn't damp with black mold and has virtually no insulation. Poverty looks like being unable to get clothes for your children. Being a guy in your 30s living with your parents in a house with presumably, electricity and heating and insulation, somewhere to live, a roof over your head, that's not what poverty looks like. That is insulting to people who genuinely live in poverty in New Zealand. So let's look at actual poverty. So what does this look like? So why does the stigma not enough? Firstly, in communities where there is a high level of poverty, which is where most people live in, where most people in poverty actually live in, it is less of a stigma because so many people within the community are also dependent on the welfare system, right? So if you live in Porirua, in Eastern Porirua, a lot of people will be dependent on the welfare system. So there's less of a stigma because everyone in your community actually understands the situation you're in. You're unlikely to have a lot of interactions with people from upper middle class backgrounds where they'll give you some cold shoulder or something. It's unlikely to happen. Secondly, people often just don't talk. People don't often just talk around the fact that they have poverty, especially if they are from those middle class backgrounds. It's not like you're just oh yeah, how's it going? Oh, it's great. I just collected my job seekers check. People generally don't talk about it, so there's less of a stigma around that because people can quite easily keep it private. Lastly, and most importantly, the opportunity cost of not taking the job seekers benefit is failing to get clothing. It's failing to keep the power on. It's failing to put a roof over your head. That is the opportunity cost that comes with not taking the job seekers benefit. And even if because of how important strong the incentives are, regardless, even if we can't prove that there is no stigma, there's the incentive of literally having a roof over your head is so strong of an incentive that it overrides any need. It overrides any stigma that is created. And even if we take the example of the 30-year-old guy living in their parents' house, not only do we believe that principally they shouldn't be on the benefit if they have they probably don't need it if they have somewhere to live, but secondly, if they made the decision not to go on the benefit, then they have decided that the social stigma is too much and that they actually don't need the welfare that much. So you don't see that that's a big anyways. Secondly, we talked about the immense cost of means testing at welfare means testing work and income New Zealand. What we say to that is that that there is more that happens in work and income than just means testing. When the social workers sit down with you and talk about your situation, that is more than just asking how many job interviews have you returned the calls for. They actually look at your situation, they look at what's impacting you, they actually can talk you through things like addiction that you're dealing with in your life. The social workers that are employed by WINS aren't just unnecessary costs that should be going towards checks for the wealth. Social workers have a critical function in our country, and we reject any attempt to characterize them as unnecessary or just dead weight in the economy. That is insulting to the social workers who are keeping New Zealand afloat. Secondly, also heard about how it's better for these people to be trying to start their own businesses or like working on art or whatever. Okay, firstly, we say that that's completely unrealistic, right? If you get a UBI check and you're only just above the poverty line, you do not have the capacity to start a business. Firstly, it's more difficult to get credit because if everyone gets the same UBI, then there is still the same amount of credit that banks are willing to lend out. So that again, that comes back to inflation. There is not going to be more income. And secondly, they seem to have this idea that starting a business is as simple as walking into a bank and saying, hey, I want to start a business, give me a loan. It's fine, guys. I got my government check this morning. That is not how you get loans from a bank. You have to get a business plan. You have to have a case. There's a lot of loops you have to go through, and you can only jump through those. If you have an education outside the house, would be significantly better funded. I'll take the point now.
Okay, so since you want to talk about what poverty looks like is a single mother who's not qualified for the benefit and has no means for income. How does your side help that person?
Well, if you're a single mother, you probably would qualify for the working families benefits. So we reject the premise that you don't qualify for any benefits. That shows like there are literally benefits for that. But also if you're unemployed, you get you get the job seekers benefit. So we reject the characterization that they just wouldn't get a benefit, especially because that is the point raised in the POI with literally no analysis as to why it is true. So onto the last point of clash around the macroeconomic influence. And the reason that funding services is always going to be better than a UBI is that we can increase the supply while the other team can only increase demand. We can get more houses built by funding it through government. When you give people more money, landlords just charge more. We've seen this in central Wellington, when in the suburbs surrounding the university, after the government raised the student allowance by $50, the average rent surrounding Victoria University increased by $45. That is an extra $5, so congratulations to them. But $45 more is going to the landlords. Because of the lack of supply is the issue in our economy, not the lack of demand. We have so many people who want a house and so few who can get it. Giving everyone the same amount of additional money just increases the amount that landlords can extort out of their tenants. When we have a social safety net and a government that does its job, we are able to increase the number of houses and increase the number of people who don't live in just terrible quality housing surrounded by black mold and asbestos. That is why we have won this debate. And that is why we are better able to achieve outcomes for those who genuinely live in poverty. Thank you.
We thank the speaker for his speech. And now, as is customary, we reverse the speaking order and we would invite the negative leader to give the leader's reply for their team.
All good to start? Yeah.
Yep.
Great. Every dollar that goes to a UBI is a dollar that is not going towards reducing a hospital waitlist or giving another teacher to a low decile school. A UBI does not solve systemic poverty. It does not make impoverished New Zealanders more skilled or competitive in the job markets compared to a well-funded state system, and the UBI money is therefore wasted. Our side reduces poverty and reduces inequality, while F stands by. So 3 questions in this debate. Firstly, I want to clarify why it is completely within the bounds of the debate to have our model. Secondly, why we get better outcomes for people in poverty. And thirdly, why we get better outcomes for the economy. So on the first question about why it's reasonable, because F has told us that it will be too expensive, but we say we're getting the same amount of tax on each side. They're giving the money to the UBI. We're giving the money to these new institutions. They give a little. They said they'll still be funding the state system a bit, so a bit more money there. We'll still be funding benefits, a bit more money there. But on the whole, we think they're completely matched and completely reasonable on both sides. So why do we get better outcomes for people in poverty? Because we told you that there are these massive underlying issues that are putting people into poverty that are completely unaddressed by the UBI. When we have a failing healthcare system that does not treat people, allow them to see their full potential, a failing education system that does not allow people to get off the ground and get the skills they need to compete in the job market with the rich people who can go to private school, people who can, literally cannot afford electricity to heat their house and thrive. Those are the real issues that mean people are stuck in poverty in this cycle. And we break that when we allow more funding to the social services. People just cannot get it off the ground without that funding. We were told instead that by having welfare system, then we're going to put stigma on people in welfare, so they just won't take welfare, and then they'll run into trouble. We say, like, we had 4 responses to that. Firstly, there is an opportunity cost that is very clear. People have priorities. They know that they'd rather feed their family to get them housing, to get them shoes, than they would to, like, maybe get some stigma against some people. We've told you it's far more important for people to actually thrive than to maybe be in the way of some stigma. We say, secondly, like, it's really easy to keep it secret. You don't have to tell everybody you're on a benefit. It doesn't get emblazoned across your chest. It's not that big of a deal. Okay, thirdly, a lot of people are on things like working for families rather than the benefit because it's easily accessible. And fourthly, New Zealand is proud of its welfare state, right? Like, and we're proud of the things we're able to provide. We think that it's not that big of a stigma when we are doling it out lots because we're happy to have it in New Zealand, right? We also say they told you would get more job options because you can get off the ground and, like, have a bit of money to get started in a job. We say when you get better education from the start by funding the health in the education system, people are better equipped to have good jobs than they are to just have a bit more money to maybe get a good job. Like, you were equipping them to, like, empower themselves from the start. And we also were told, like, people have no incentive to work when they're on the benefit, when we keep our benefits in place. We say 3 responses to that. Firstly, people like having jobs. It makes them feel like they're contributing to society rather than just being on the benefit. Secondly, you do have to provide evidence that you're searching for a job when you're getting money for the benefit. And thirdly, there is a job seeker structure that ensures that people, like, it's more beneficial to be working than to be on the benefit. So we basically prove concrete outcomes to fix a broken system that means people can't get off the ground, can't get the jobs they need, whereas AF just gives a few more dollars to people in a struggling system that has allowed them to fall into poverty in the first place. Secondly, why do they get bad effects on the economy? Because they create inflation, right? Because they got the same supply of houses, but they have, like, more money for people trying to buy it. So prices are just going to go up. We told you that a million times. Instead, we fix this by increasing the supply of houses, by building houses. The government builds these houses. That means that, like, people can actually access this housing instead of, like, increasing the house prices to exorbitant levels they can never afford on a small amount more money that the UBI can provide. We also said that people won't just, like, amazingly get more jobs because banks but they won't be able to invest in new businesses because the banks are just going to simply raise that threshold because everyone has more money. So we say that on the whole, we are fixing this broken system, whereas AF is relegating people to live in poverty because they don't fix the underlying issues in society.
Thank the speaker for her speech. And finally, to give the final speech of today's debate and of the end rounds for the tournament, we welcome the leader of the affirmative team to give their team's leader's reply.
Panel, I was really confused from those speeches I heard from side negative. Because on one hand, they told us that beneficiaries should have their hands held and be stopped from spending massive amounts of money on things like alcohol counselling, but also, and these people would be fundamentally irrational if they were given money, but also they were fundamentally rational enough to always seek exactly the benefits they deserved, to never fall through the gaps. We tell you a far more realistic conception of the most vulnerable. These are people who are struggling to get by, but oftentimes don't have access to the kinds of resources that they need because they're just above the threshold, or they just got a minimum wage job, which still pays marginally less than the benefit, but they now have to make that economic calculus and say goodbye to the benefit. We tell you that individuals are best placed to make choices about their lives, and we told them that they were never able to deal with this. You have people falling through the cracks and people that can't deal with situations. What am I going to do in this speech? I'm going to recap points about why we better improve poverty overall, why we grant more opportunity and choice to the most vulnerable individuals, and then thirdly, talk to you a bit about economic growth. Firstly, on the poverty situation, because they had 2 main attacks to our material in this point. First of all, they just told us these 2 things were fundamentally inconsistent. These were things about benefits being fundamentally stigmatized things, and being on welfare is just really hard to go onto because of the amount of social backlash. But secondarily, that it was oftentimes it meant you had to sacrifice a job. We told you that these 2 were totally consistent in today's case. We tell you for a vast majority of people that just fall under the poverty line or just qualify for these things, they oftentimes don't want to go onto the benefit. Additionally, we tell you for middle class families, they make that calculus before going onto it, that I'm going to take a job I don't want because I don't want to end up on the benefit. That's how we got all the material about things like starting jobs and starting businesses. And that's why we got all the material about middle class families making poor decisions under the current world because they don't want to be seen as the poor people. Crucially, we tell you, however, once you fall under that bar of like being okay with the massive social backlash, then you get stuck in a trap where you're never able to leave, because we tell you you'll raise your children in a family where they stay on job seekers, and we tell the family that you start in poverty traps. We tell you that that job seekers benefit is marginally better than the amount of money you earn in a minimum wage job, but crucially you lose that benefit to the point you get that job, so people stay in that for a long period of time. Their response to this was frankly insulting. It was just like, well, then get a better education, we'll train you up later. First of all, this only actually works under their side in the long term. We tell you we help people right now, immediately. But second of all, we tell you that oftentimes for a lot of poor people, they just simply lack the kinds of tools and skills to be able to get these jobs in the first place. We tell you that you can't, like, it's not, if you get that minimum wage job at McDonald's, you can never work your way up to CEO. You're always going to be stuck in a dead end position. That's really bad. We allow massive amounts of poverty reduction. All they do is help marginally improve social services. We tell you in a worst case scenario, we can still do this through slight increases in spending on things like removing black mold from hospital care. But additionally, we just refute the characterization that hospitals are nearly as bad as they say they are. We still have significant spending. That's why the welfare system, as they told us, something we're nationally proud of. Additionally, onto this about opportunity and choice, because this was crucial material in this debate. We told you that we want to spend this money on improving ways that people can actually make decisions about their quality of life. Because what they're going to do is pump money into systems like healthcare and education, systems that oftentimes people can't access themselves, until it's far more meaningful to give people money they can spend on what they want to spend it on, for instance, writing a book or starting a business. They told us either this is unrealistic or that, like, we don't care about your creative ambitions. First of all, we tell you there's oftentimes a lot of people who just like would do very well but don't have a safety net in the first place. We won't tell you that we're gonna like have an explosion of people like starting massive ass businesses. We tell you it's just having a safety net to fall back onto in case that business fails. But crucially, a lot of people just like are scared of taking risks because like even if they went to the bank and got the loan, they just don't think it would ever be worth it. That's really crucial. We get people opportunity, you have more choice. Then on material about market economic growth. First of all, as we told you, like the government tends to be incredibly inefficient with the way they build. They conceded even in their first speech that Kiwi bills had massively failed. We had no analysis as to why this wouldn't be the case under their side of the house. We tell you governments are bad at allocating resources. The price system is far better. Additionally, we told you that like what was going to happen is you're going to have more opportunities for people to grow businesses and you'll have more growth in the long term. But at the end of this, maybe this could have been refuted by the material on inflation, but that did come out at 7 minutes 59, so we're not going to deal with it in this reply. At the end of this, we get a better economy and overall we help the poor. Proud to affirm.
Well done, everyone, for a great round